Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. In the 1980s, a chilling pattern emerged along the highways of the American South. Young women with red or reddish hair began turning up dead near major interstates, their bodies carefully placed, their identities unknown. From Tennessee to Mississippi, Kentucky to Arkansas, these Jane Does shared two haunting characteristics: their vibrant red hair and their tragic ends. Most were believed to be hitchhikers or drifters, making their identifications nearly impossible. The FBI suspected a long-haul trucker was responsible, using America's highways as his hunting ground. Tonight, we dive into one of the most mysterious serial killing sprees of the 1980s, the Redhead murders. Let's begin. In the sprawling landscape of American highways during the 1980s, a sinister pattern began to emerge. Along the quiet shoulders and wooded embankments of major interstates cutting through the American South, a series of gruesome discoveries would eventually point to what investigators now call the Redhead murders. This is a story that begins not with a single victim, but with multiple young women, connected by two haunting commonalities: their vibrant red hair and the tragic circumstances of their deaths. On April 1st, 1985, near Jellicoe, Tennessee, just off Interstate 75, a maintenance worker made the first of what would become a string of similar discoveries. The body of a young woman was found carefully placed near the highway, almost as if she had been laid to rest. She had red hair, and like many of the victims who would follow, she carried no identification. The woman, estimated to be between 18 and 25 years old, became known as the Jellicoe Jane Doe. What made this case particularly challenging for investigators was the state of the victim. She had been dead for several days, and the elements had taken their toll. However, medical examiners were able to determine that she had been strangled, and there were signs that she had recently given birth, perhaps within a year of her death. This detail would later become crucial as investigators tried to piece together her identity. The discovery in Jellicoe might have remained an isolated incident, but just 3 months later, another body was found. This time, the location was Campbell County, Tennessee, again near Interstate 75. The victim shared striking similarities with the Jellicoe Jane Doe: red hair, young, and no identification. She too had been strangled. As law enforcement agencies began to compare notes, they realized they were dealing with something far more extensive than isolated incidents. Reports began surfacing from neighboring states: Kentucky, West Virginia, Arkansas, and Mississippi. All involved young women with red or reddish hair, all found near major highways, and most tragically, all unidentified. One of the most compelling cases emerged in Greene County, Tennessee, where a young woman's body was discovered in 1985. She became known as the Greene County Jane Doe, and her case provided investigators with slightly more detail than the others. She was wearing distinctive jewelry, a necklace with a heart-shaped pendant, and had extensive dental work that suggested she had access to good medical care at some point in her life. Yet despite these potentially identifying characteristics, she remained nameless. The pattern that emerged suggested a killer who was likely a long-haul truck driver or someone who traveled extensively for work. The placement of the bodies near major trucking routes was too precise to be coincidental. Each victim was found within easy access of an interstate exit, suggesting the killer was familiar with the highway system and chose locations that allowed for quick disposal and getaway. Law enforcement officials began to piece together a profile of the perpetrator. They believed they were looking for someone who could move freely across state lines without arousing suspicion. The killer would need to have a legitimate reason for traveling these routes regularly, and the timing of the murders suggested someone who worked night shifts or had an irregular schedule. What made these cases particularly challenging was the victim profile. Many of these women appeared to be transient, possibly hitchhikers or individuals living on the margins of society. This made identification nearly impossible, as many may not have been reported missing. In the 1980s, before the advent of DNA databases and modern forensic techniques, identifying unknown victims relied heavily on missing persons reports and dental records. The FBI became involved, recognizing the interstate nature of the crimes. They began to analyze the geographic pattern, noting that the bodies were typically found along what truckers refer to as the Southeast Triangle, a network of highways connecting Tennessee, Kentucky, and Georgia. This area saw heavy truck traffic, with hundreds of vehicles passing through daily, making it nearly impossible to track specific vehicles or drivers. One of the most frustrating aspects for investigators was the lack of witness accounts. Despite the bodies being found near busy highways, no one reported seeing anything suspicious. The killer seemed to operate in the dead of night, choosing remote spots that offered privacy despite their proximity to major roads. The method of murder also provided few clues. Strangulation, while intimate and personal, left little forensic evidence compared to other methods of killing. The killer was careful, methodical, and seemed to understand how to minimize evidence. This level of sophistication suggested someone who either had experience with law enforcement or had carefully studied how to avoid detection. As the number of victims grew, so did the fear among young women, particularly those with red hair in the southern United States. Local newspapers began running stories warning about the danger of hitchhiking, and truck stops posted notices about the murders. The trucking community itself became both suspicious and defensive. While many recognized that the killer likely came from their ranks, they also felt unfairly targeted by law enforcement. The investigation was further complicated by jurisdictional issues. With bodies found across multiple states, coordination between different law enforcement agencies became crucial but challenging. Each state had its own procedures, and communication between departments wasn't always smooth. Evidence gathered in one jurisdiction didn't always make it to investigators in another, and valuable connections were sometimes missed. One of the most promising leads came from a truck stop waitress in Kentucky who reported serving a suspicious customer who seemed particularly interested in red-headed women. She described him as polite but intense and said he would often sit for hours watching the parking lot and making conversation with young women who came into the restaurant. However, like many leads in the case, this one eventually went cold. The witness description from the Kentucky truck stop waitress led investigators to conduct extensive interviews at similar establishments along the interstate corridors where bodies had been found. While several other witnesses came forward with similar accounts of suspicious customers, none of the leads produced a viable suspect that could be connected to all the murders. In late 1985, another victim was discovered, this time near Greenville, Tennessee. Like the others, she had distinctive red hair, but there was something different about this case. The victim, later identified as Lisa Nichols, was found wearing a distinctive blue and white cheerleading jacket from West Virginia. This was the first time investigators had a name, a real person to connect to the series of murders. Lisa had been reported missing by her family, and her identification provided hope that other victims might also be identified. Lisa's case revealed a crucial pattern in the killer's victim selection. She had been last seen at a truck stop along Interstate 81, attempting to hitchhike. This confirmed investigators' suspicions that the killer was targeting vulnerable women who frequented truck stops and rest areas. Lisa's murder also provided investigators with their first solid timeline. They could trace her movements from the moment she was last seen to the discovery of her body. The medical examiner's report on Lisa Nichols revealed another disturbing detail. There were signs that she had been held captive for several days before her death. This suggested the killer had a secure location where he could hold victims, possibly a truck with a sleeper cab or a private residence near one of the highways where the bodies were found. In 1986, the investigation took another turn when a body was discovered near Jellicoe, Tennessee, almost exactly 1 year after the first victim had been found there. This victim, also with red hair, showed signs of having been killed elsewhere and transported to the dump site. The medical examiner noted that the body had been cleaned and carefully positioned, suggesting a level of ritual behavior that hadn't been as evident in earlier cases. The FBI's behavioral science unit, still in its relative infancy at the time, developed a comprehensive profile of the killer. They suggested he was likely a white male between 30 and 40 years old, physically strong enough to overpower his victims, but non-threatening in appearance. They believed he was intelligent and organized, given his ability to avoid leaving evidence and his careful selection of dump sites. The profile suggested he likely had a stable job and might even have a family, using his legitimate travel for work as cover for his crimes. One of the most chilling aspects of the case emerged when investigators began mapping the locations of all known and suspected victims. They discovered that the bodies were often found in pairs, roughly 100 to 150 miles apart, suggesting the killer was dumping victims during regular routes. This pattern aligned perfectly with typical long-haul trucking schedules and routes. By 1987, law enforcement had compiled a list of at least 6 confirmed victims, and possibly as many as 11 women who fit the pattern. However, the true number could be much higher. Given the transient nature of many of the victims and the vast territory covered by the killer, there was a strong possibility that some bodies were never found or were discovered but not connected to the series. The investigation was dealt another challenging blow when similar murders began appearing in other parts of the country. Women with red hair were found murdered near highways in states as far away as Texas and Ohio. While some of these cases were eventually determined to be unrelated, they complicated the investigation and stretched already limited resources even thinner. In late 1987, a potential breakthrough came when a young woman with red hair escaped from an attempted abduction at a truck stop in Virginia. She provided a detailed description of her attacker and his vehicle, a dark-colored semi-truck with distinctive striping. However, despite an extensive search and the circulation of a composite sketch, the suspect was never identified. The description did match several other witness accounts from truck stops where victims had last been seen. The case took an interesting turn when investigators began looking into missing persons reports for red-headed women from the early 1980s, before the first officially recognized victim was found. They discovered several cases that might have been connected, suggesting the killer had been active longer than initially thought. One such case involved a young woman who disappeared from a truck stop in Arkansas in 1983. While her body was never found, the circumstances of her disappearance matched the killer's pattern perfectly. As the decade drew to a close, the frequency of murders appeared to decrease, though investigators couldn't be certain if the killer had stopped or simply become more careful about body disposal. The reduction in killings coincided with increased media attention and heightened security at truck stops, including the installation of better lighting and security cameras at many locations. The case would eventually become one of the most extensive interstate murder investigations of the 1980s, involving dozens of law enforcement agencies and hundreds of investigators. The FBI maintained an active file on the case, periodically reviewing evidence as new forensic techniques became available. The advent of DNA testing in the late 1980s provided new hope for identifying victims and potentially linking cases conclusively, though many of the original crime scenes had not been processed with DNA collection in mind. The dawn of the 1990s brought new challenges and opportunities to the investigation. As DNA technology advanced, investigators began the painstaking process of attempting to extract viable samples from evidence that had been collected years earlier. Unfortunately, due to the storage methods and technology available during the original investigations, many samples had degraded beyond usefulness. In 1992, a task force was formed to review all potentially related cases and create a comprehensive database of victim characteristics, crime scene details, and witness statements. This effort revealed several previously unnoticed patterns. For instance, many of the victims showed signs of having recently traveled long distances before their deaths, evidenced by the dust and wear patterns on their clothing. Some had bus or truck stop tickets in their possession, suggesting they were deliberately making their way along interstate routes. One of the most significant developments came in 1994, when advances in forensic reconstruction allowed experts to create more detailed images of the unidentified victims' faces. These reconstructions, far more sophisticated than the original sketches, were distributed widely through new channels, including the recently launched television show America's Most Wanted. While these efforts didn't lead to immediate identifications, they generated hundreds of new leads and kept public interest in the cases alive. The investigation took an unexpected turn in 1995 when a retired truck driver in Tennessee came forward with information about a colleague who had made suspicious comments about redheaded women in the mid-1980s. The potential suspect had died in a traffic accident in 1988, but investigators discovered that his trucking routes closely matched the locations where bodies had been found. However, without definitive evidence linking him to the crimes, this lead, like many others, remained speculative. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the case was the impact on the victims' families, both known and unknown. Lisa Nichols' family established a support network for families of missing persons, particularly those who might have been victims of highway killers. Their efforts helped bring attention to the broader issue of highway serial killings and the vulnerability of people traveling alone on America's interstate system. In 2000, the FBI launched the Highway Serial Killings Initiative, partly inspired by the Redhead murders case. This program created a national database to track murders along highway corridors and identify patterns that might connect seemingly unrelated cases. The Redhead murders became a case study in how mobile killers could exploit the interstate system to commit crimes across jurisdictional boundaries. One of the more recent developments came in 2018 when students at Elizabethton High School in Tennessee took up the case as part of a sociology project. Their research led to new theories about victim identification and possible connections to other unsolved murders. The students' work brought fresh attention to the cases and demonstrated how community involvement could help keep cold cases alive. The geographic profile of the murders, when analyzed with modern techniques, revealed something investigators had missed in the 1980s. The killer appeared to have a comfort zone centered around the Tennessee-Kentucky border, with murders radiating outward along major trucking routes. This suggested that while the killer traveled widely, they likely had a home base in this region. In recent years, genetic genealogy has offered new hope for identifying the remaining Jane Does. This technique, which combines DNA analysis with traditional genealogical research, has successfully identified victims in other cold cases from the same era. Several of the Redhead murders victims' DNA profiles have been submitted to databases, waiting for potential family matches. The case has also highlighted the evolution of highway safety measures over the past 4 decades. Many of the locations where bodies were found now have security cameras, improved lighting, and emergency call boxes. Truck stops have implemented better security protocols, and the advent of cell phones has made it harder for predators to isolate potential victims. the legacy of the Redhead murders extends beyond the immediate investigation. The case helped establish protocols for investigating interstate serial killings and demonstrated the need for better cooperation between law enforcement agencies. It also drew attention to the vulnerabilities of people living transient lifestyles and led to improved missing persons databases. Today, the case remains officially unsolved, though investigators continue to receive and follow up on new leads. The FBI maintains an active file, and advances in forensic science offer hope that some of the remaining victims might eventually be identified. The case serves as a sobering reminder of a time when America's highways provided perfect hunting grounds for predators who understood how to exploit the vastness of the interstate system and the limitations of law enforcement jurisdictions. The Redhead murders also continue to influence modern criminal investigations, particularly in cases involving highway killings. The lessons learned from this investigation have helped shape how law enforcement approaches similar cases today, emphasizing the importance of interagency cooperation, comprehensive victim identification efforts, and the need to consider broader geographic patterns in serial crimes. As we look back on this case, we're reminded that behind each unidentified victim was a real person with hopes, dreams, and families who may still be searching for answers. The red-haired women who lost their lives along America's highways in the 1980s may remain unnamed, but their stories continue to drive efforts to identify other victims and bring closure to families of the missing. Their cases remain active, waiting for that one crucial piece of evidence that might finally bring answers to one of the most mysterious serial killing sprees in American criminal history.